Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill before us, H.R. 2594.
Without objection, so ordered.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to include in the congressional record the exchange of letters between the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure concerning H.R. 2594.
Without objection, so ordered.
Speaker, I yield myself such time as I might
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in support of the bill before us, H.R. 2594, the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme Prohibition Act of 2011. Starting in January of 2012, the European Union will begin to unilaterally apply its emissions trading scheme to civil aviation operators landing in or departing from one of the EU member states. Under the emissions trading scheme, EU member states will require international air carriers and operators to pay for emission allowances and, in some cases, penalties for carbon emissions. The scheme will apply to the entire length of the flight, including those parts of the flight outside the EU airspace. For instance, a flight leaving Los Angeles for London, taxes would be levied not just on the portion of the flight over the United Kingdom, but also for the portions of the flight over the United States sovereign soil and the high seas. On September 30th, 21 countries, including the U.S., signed a joint declaration against the EU emissions trading scheme in New Delhi, India. Despite serious legal issues and objections by the international community, the EU is pressing ahead with its plans. The bill before us will prohibit U.S. aircraft operators from participating in this illegal scheme put forward unilaterally by the EU. The European Union's unilateral application of the scheme onto U.S. flag operators without the consent of the United States government raises significant legal concerns under international law, including violations of the Chicago Convention and the U.S.-EU Air Transportation Agreement. There are also concerns that the emissions trading scheme is nothing more than a revenue raiser for EU member states, as there is no requirement that EU member states must use the funds for anything related to the reduction of carbon dioxide production by the civil aviation sector. The emissions trading scheme will extract money from the airline industry that would otherwise be invested in next-gen technologies and the purchase of new aircraft, just 2 proven methods for improving environmental performance. In addition, the scheme would introduce a new commodities market into the cost structure for airlines. Given the havoc fluctuating oil markets have played on the U.S. airline industry, it doesn't make sense to subject the struggling airline industry to another commodities market that is vulnerable to speculation. According to the Air Transportation Association's a testimony before the Aviation Subcommittee this July, the extraction of capital from the aviation system as envisioned under the EU emissions trading scheme could threaten as many as 78,500 U.S. jobs. This is unacceptable. Finally, there are considerable concerns about the proliferation of EU member states' eco charges being put in place on top of the emissions trading scheme. Questions have arisen as to whether the eco-charges are consistent with U.S. member states' obligations under international law and whether some of these charges may, in effect, be double charges for the same emissions the EU intends to regulate under the emissions trading scheme. Given all of these concerns, we believe that the European Union needs to slow down, carefully weigh their plans to include international civil aviation in their emissions trading scheme. We believe a better approach is to work within the international civil aviation community through the UN International Civil Aviation Organization to establish consensus-driven initiatives to reduce emissions. However, because the EU has shown no interest in working with the international community to address their concerns and objections and to seek a global approach to civil aviation emissions, we are moving this bipartisan legislation forward to ensure U.S. operators will not participate in their unilateral and questionable scheme. The Obama administration and Republicans and Democrats here in the House have recognized the troubled approach taken by the Europeans and have expressed ardent opposition. This legislation is one of many avenues the United States can take concurrent with others, to resolve this conflict. To be sure, the United States government will use all tools at its disposal to hold our aviation interests harmless from the Europeans' unfair and illegal scheme. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman